Ethan Carter slammed his hand flat against the fuselage of a $40 million jet and told the most powerful woman in the room she wasn't going anywhere. The CEO froze. The investors went silent. The chief pilot actually laughed out loud. Because the man blocking that aircraft was wearing a faded uniform, driving a rusted pickup, and had a crumpled photo of a 10-year-old boy tucked in his chest pocket. Nobody in that hangar believed him. But here's the thing, nobody saw coming that single crack Ethan found. It wasn't just in the metal. What city are you watching from tonight? Drop it in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. And if you're new here, hit subscribe. You won't want to miss where this goes. The noodles were almost done when his phone rang. Ethan Carter stood at the stove in his kitchen, a narrow, honest kitchen, with linoleum floors and a refrigerator that hummed too loud, stirring a pot of instant ramen, because that was Tuesday. That was most nights, actually. Not because he was lazy, not because he didn't care, because caring for Ethan cost everything he had and everything he had went to the boy sitting at the table behind him. Ben Carter, 10 years old, was doing his homework with his tongue pressed between his teeth, the way he always did when he was concentrating. Math, long division. He had his mother's eyebrows, that small, focused furrow that appeared when something demanded his full attention. Ethan noticed it every single time, and every single time it hit him somewhere quiet and deep, like a stone dropped into still water. Dad, what's 7 times 9? 63. You didn't even think about it. I've been thinking about it for 38 years, bud. Ben grunted, wrote something down, erased it, wrote it again. Ethan turned back to the stove. The steam rose from the pot. Outside, the Texas night was warm and thick, and somewhere down the block a neighbor's dog was barking at nothing. This was their life, and Ethan Carter had made his peace with it. He had given up a lot to get here. Not the kind of thing he talked about, not with coworkers, not with Ben's teachers, not with anyone really. What he'd had before, what he'd walked away from, was the kind of career that other men built their entire identities around. But when Sarah died, the identity stopped mattering. Only the boy mattered. Only Tuesday nights with bad ramen and long division, and the particular way Ben furrowed his brows. His phone buzzed on the counter. He glanced at the screen. Private airport. His dispatch supervisor. He answered. Carter. The voice on the other end was tight, strained. Gerald Marsh, night operations manager, a man who prided himself on never sounding rattled. He sounded rattled. I need you out here, right now. We've got a situation with the Sinclair aircraft. What kind of situation? The kind where I've got a CEO screaming in my ear, and a flight crew telling me everything's fine, and I need someone I actually trust to walk that plane. A pause. You're the only guy I trust on short notice, Ethan. Only guy I trust on short notice, Ethan. Ethan looked at the pot of ramen. He looked at Ben. Ben. The boy looked up. Mrs. Kowalski next door, she's home tonight. Yeah, her lights were on. You're gonna go eat those noodles, then go knock on her door and tell her I had a work call. She'll let you stay until I'm back. Ben's face did the thing, that careful, quiet thing it did whenever he was deciding whether to be upset about something. He was 10. He'd gotten very good at that calculation. Too good, maybe, for a 10-year-old. Okay, Ben said. Just okay. And then, be safe, Dad. Ethan pulled on his jacket. Always. Sinclair Aviation's private terminal sat at the east end of the regional airport, a gleaming glass and steel structure that existed in a different world than the rest of the field. This was where money lived. Old money, new money, aggressive money. The kind of terminal that had real espresso machines and artwork on the walls and carpet that made your footsteps disappear. Ethan pulled up in his truck, a 2003 Ford F-150 that had 190,000 miles on it and a cracked passenger side mirror he kept meaning to replace, and parked it among the black SUVs and leased luxury sedans like a wrong note in a symphony. He grabbed his flashlight, his tool bag, and his worn work jacket with Carter stitched over the breast pocket, and he walked through the service entrance. He heard the voices before he saw anyone, It cannot be delayed. Do you understand what's at stake here? The Meridian Group flies back to Frankfurt in 48 hours. Ms. Sinclair, I completely understand. Then stop explaining and start fixing whatever imaginary problem your ground crew has invented. Ethan stepped into the hangar. The aircraft was a Gulfstream G700 long white immaculate worth somewhere north of $40 million and maintained like a museum piece. Under the hangar lights, it looked almost sculptural, almost untouchable. Around it stood a small constellation of people who all radiated the same energy-controlled panic wearing expensive clothes. There was the flight crew chief pilot, Ray Kohler, a broad-shouldered man with 22 years of commercial and private aviation behind him, standing with his arms crossed and his jaw set. There were two ground technicians Ethan recognized from the day shift, both of them looking uncomfortable. There were three men in dark suits, who didn't introduce themselves but radiated money and impatience in equal measure, the international investors Ethan guessed. And there, at the center of everything, was Victoria Sinclair. Ethan had seen her photo before. She ran a company with over 400 employees and contracts with three major government aerospace clients. 32 years old and already in that particular orbit where everything she said became policy. She was sharp-looking dark blazer, dark eyes, the kind of composure that looked effortless but was clearly costing her something tonight. She was on her phone. Then she wasn't. Then she saw Ethan. Her eyes moved over him with the speed and thoroughness of someone accustomed to making fast assessments. The worn jacket, the old boots, the truck probably visible through the hangar window, the flashlight in his hand like he'd wandered in from a camping trip. "You're the maintenance tech they called?" she asked. "Ethan Carter, ma'am, night maintenance structural inspection." She turned back to Kohler. "Ray, this is your expert." Kohler cleared his throat. "He's qualified. Gerald vouches for him." "I don't need vouching. I need this aircraft cleared for departure by 0600. She looked at Ethan again, not dismissively exactly, but with the particular efficiency of someone allocating his importance to the correct category. "Walk the plane. Clear it. We're wheels up in 4 hours. Ethan nodded once. He didn't argue. He never argued before he looked. He started at the nose. The hangar was loud, in the way that empty large spaces are loud. Echoing voices, the distant whine of equipment on the tarmac outside the particular hum of expensive machinery at rest. Behind him, the conversations continued. The investors spoke among themselves in low, urgent tones. Kohler stood near the aircraft steps with his arms still crossed. Victoria paced in a slow, deliberate rectangle near the far wall phone, pressed to her ear. Nobody watched Ethan. That was fine. He'd spent 2 years now being nobody that nobody watched. He moved along the fuselage with his flashlight, methodical, unhurried. Left side, nose section, moving aft. He checked the wing route fairing, checked the landing gear bays. His eyes were instruments really trained over years of work that most people in this room didn't know he'd done in facilities they'd never heard of on aircraft, far more complex than this one. Jiba, he wasn't supposed to be here technically. Not at this level. He was a maintenance tech. Qualified, experienced, but a maintenance tech. The man he used to be the aerospace engineer with the clearances and the publications and the government contracts that man had walked into a hospital room 4 years ago, watched his wife breathe her last breath, and left that identity on the floor next to her bed. He didn't miss it exactly. He just sometimes felt the shape of it. He reached the aft fuselage section just forward of the tail. He moved the flashlight slowly. Standard inspection, standard sequence. His eyes tracked the metal surface, looking for anything that didn't belong. He almost missed it. A shadow. A line that wasn't a line. One of those things that looks like a trick of the light until it doesn't. Ethan stopped. He crouched down. He moved the flashlight closer, changed the angle. The line resolved not a shadow, not a rivet seam, not a paint scratch. A crack. Hairline. approximately 4 centimeters. Running at a diagonal angle across a primary frame section just below the horizontal stabilizer attachment. Ethan stayed crouched for a long moment. He knew exactly what he was looking at. He knew what it meant at altitude under pressurization, with the airframe cycling through the stresses of climb and cruise. He stood up. "Everybody stop," he said. Not loudly. He didn't need to be loud. The hangar went quiet the way it does when someone says something so unexpected that the air itself pauses. That long. Victoria Sinclair turned from her phone call. Kohler uncrossed his arms. The investors looked over. "This aircraft," Ethan said clearly, "is grounded." The laughter came from Kohler first. Not cruel laughter. The kind that happens when something surprises you short, almost involuntary. "Son," Kohler said, walking over with his hands in his pockets. "I personally supervised the pre-flight on this aircraft 3 hours ago. My crew checked. I need everyone away from the aircraft," Ethan said. He wasn't looking at Kohler. He was looking at Victoria. "Carter," Kohler's voice tightened. "I've got 22 years in the cockpit and I've signed off on more aircraft than you've probably—" "This isn't about the cockpit," Ethan said. "There's a crack in the aft fuselage frame, section 47 aft of the horizontal stabilizer, hairline approximately 4 centimeters diagonal orientation." Silence. "Then, show me," Kohler said. "Don't bring anyone near the aircraft until I've established a secure perimeter and called this in too." "Show me the crack, Carter." Kohler's voice was patient in the way that men are patient when they're certain they're right. He walked to the aft section. He crouched where Ethan pointed. He ran his flashlight along the same surface. "I don't see anything," Kohler said. "Change your angle. 11 o'clock position from the frame seam." Kohler adjusted. Looked again. "That's a paint variation," Kohler said. He stood up. "I'm telling you that is a surface artifact. Paint stress from temperature cycling. I have seen that 100. "It's not paint," Ethan said. Victoria walked over. Her heels clicked against the hangar floor and stopped. She looked at the spot on the aircraft, then at Ethan, then at Kohler. "Ray," she said quietly. "Are you certain?" "Ms. Sinclair, I've been flying Gulfstreams for 16 years. If there were a structural issue, I need a third opinion," she said. "With respect," Kohler said, "we don't have time for a third opinion. The Meridian Group." "The Meridian Group doesn't know about any of this." Her voice was very controlled. "And I'd like to keep it that way, so let's settle this quickly." She looked at Ethan. "Call your supervisor. Get whoever you need. But you have 30 minutes. "I can't clear this aircraft in 30 minutes, Ethan said. Her composure cracked just slightly, just around the eyes. "What do you mean you can't?" "I mean I can't clear an aircraft with a structural anomaly in a primary frame section without a full NDT assessment. Non-destructive testing. Ultrasonic, possibly magnetic particle. That takes time. Hours, not minutes." "We're talking about a mark on the paint. We're talking about a crack in the metal," Ethan said, and his voice was even, firm, not aggressive. "And if you put this aircraft in the air with that crack, you are gambling with every person on board." One of the suited men, the lead investor, a German named Brandt, that Ethan had heard mentioned, stepped forward. His English was precise and unimpressed. "Young man, do you know what this flight represents? This is a $200 million partnership agreement. You are one maintenance worker." "Yes," Ethan said. "I am." He turned back to the aircraft. He pulled out his phone and started making calls. Victoria watched him. She didn't mean to. She meant to be on her own calls, managing Brandt, managing Kohler, managing the 4 spinning plates of tonight's disaster. But something about the way Ethan Carter moved around that aircraft caught her attention and held it. He wasn't defensive. That was the strange thing. Every other man in this hangar was performing something. Kohler was performing authority. Brandt was performing wealth. Her own legal counsel had shown up and was performing competence from a safe distance. But this man in the worn jacket just worked. Like he was alone in the hangar. Like there was nothing else in the room. She'd noticed the photo when he crouched to look at the aircraft. A boy, maybe 9 or 10, grinning with a gap between his front teeth. Tucked in his breast pocket in a way that suggested it was always there. Always. She'd had her assistant pull up his employee file in the time it took Kohler to argue with him. Ethan Carter, 38. Night shift maintenance tech, 5 years at this facility. Prior employment, she found 3 years at Harlow Aircraft Services, and before that, dying. Before that, nothing. A gap of almost a year. And before the gap, Victoria stopped scrolling and looked up from her phone. She looked at Ethan Carter crouched next to her $40 million aircraft in his worn jacket and his old boots, and she felt something shift very quietly in her chest. She crossed the hangar. Carter. She kept her voice low enough that Brandt and the others couldn't hear. My assistant just pulled your employment history. Okay, he said, not looking up from his phone. There's a gap before Harlow. She paused. And before the gap, you worked for Lockheed Martin's Structural Analysis Division. And before that, NASA's Langley Research Center. He looked up. You have 3 published papers in the Journal of Aircraft, she said. One of them is specifically about fatigue cracking in pressurized fuselage structures. Ethan said nothing. You're not a maintenance tech, she said. Tonight I am, he said. Then, Ms. Sinclair. That crack is real. I need you to trust me or tell me to leave, because those are the only 2 options. She looked at him for a long moment. Behind her, Brandt was speaking sharply to someone on his phone. Kohler was standing near the aircraft steps, with his arms crossed, radiating professional offense. Her CFO had just walked in from the parking lot, looking like he hadn't slept in 3 days, which he probably hadn't. Everything was burning, and this man was crouched in the ashes of her evening, telling her he'd found one small crack. How much time do you need? She said. Independent structural team. I want them here by 4 a.m. If they clear the aircraft, you can fly. If they don't, she said, and her voice was very quiet now, I lose everything. Ethan looked at her, and she had the disconcerting experience of being looked at. Actually looked at, not evaluated, not managed by someone who was not trying to take anything from her. No, he said. If they don't, you lose the deal. There's a difference. He stood up. He looked at the aircraft one more time. I already know what they're going to find. He walked back toward the service entrance phone to his ear to make the calls that would keep the plane on the ground. Victoria stood there in the middle of her perfect hangar, surrounded by her perfect aircraft and her perfectly engineered crisis, and she realized something had just changed in the room. She just hadn't decided what to do about it yet. It was Brandt who made the offer. Or rather, it was Victoria relaying it, because Brandt had said it in the clipped, efficient tone of a man who closed negotiations the way other men close doors quickly and without looking back. She found Ethan near the operations desk, going over a schematic he'd pulled up on one of the maintenance terminals. I've been authorized, she said, to offer you a significant sum for your cooperation. He didn't look up from the screen. My cooperation with what? With clearing this aircraft, finding some way to sign off on the pre-flight and... No. Just that. One word. Like a door closing. Carter, I'm talking about real money. Enough to... She stopped. She'd been about to say enough to change your life. But something about the look on his face made the phrase feel small and wrong. He looked at her now, patient, not angry. Ms. Sinclair, he said, money doesn't change metal. He turned back to the schematic. This plane cannot fly. The hangar was very quiet. The hangar, And Victoria Sinclair had been in rooms with senators, with defense contractors, with men who'd built their net worth out of things she couldn't pronounce. She had held her composure through audits and hostile acquisitions, and one very public lawsuit that had tried to take everything she'd built. She had never once felt the particular kind of shame that was moving through her right now. She walked away. She didn't trust herself to speak. Behind her, Ethan Carter went back to studying the schematic. He was looking at the aircraft's structural frame drawings, tracing the load paths, calculating what a 4-centimeter diagonal crack in that precise location would mean at 37,000 feet, under cabin pressurization in turbulence. He already knew the answer. He just needed everyone else to know it too. Outside, the Texas night was beginning to lighten at its edges. Dawn coming like a slow, certain tide. And somewhere across town, in a small house with linoleum floors, his son was sleeping. Ethan Carter looked at the drawing. He thought about Sarah. He thought about Ben's eyebrows and long division, and the way this work, this honest, necessary work, felt like the only thing left in the world that he was absolutely certain he could trust. He thought about the crack. 4 centimeters. Diagonal. Primary frame section. At altitude without intervention, it could propagate in minutes. He thought about the people who would have been on that aircraft. He thought about Brandt, insufferable and alive. About Kohler, wrong and alive. About Victoria Sinclair, complicated and alive. He thought about all the names he'd never know: the co-pilot, the flight attendants, the other investors, the crew. He put the schematics down. He made one more call. "Gerald," he said, "I need you to get me the independent structural team. Tonight. Now. And I need you to put it in writing that this aircraft is grounded on my authority." A pause. "Yes. Mine. Whatever comes of it, it's on me." He hung up. He sat in the harsh light of the maintenance terminal, alone in his worn jacket, with his flashlight and his tool bag and the photograph of his son pressed against his chest. He waited for dawn. The independent structural team arrived at 4:17 in the morning. 3 men. Hard cases. The kind of engineers who got called at 3 a.m. and didn't complain about it because they'd signed up for exactly this. Lead inspector was a man named Dale Hutchins, mid-50s gray beard, the quiet authority of someone who had spent 30 years finding things that other people missed. He shook Ethan's hand without ceremony and went straight to the aircraft. Kohler was still there. He hadn't left. That said something about him. Actually, whatever else he wasn't a coward. He stood near the tail section with his arms crossed and watched Hutchins set up the ultrasonic testing equipment with the expression of a man who was absolutely certain he was about to be vindicated. Victoria was on her 3rd cup of coffee from the terminal's espresso machine. She was sitting in a chair near the operations window, legs crossed, phone face down on her knee. Not making calls anymore. Just waiting. Brandt and his associates had retreated to the private lounge 30 minutes ago. Brandt had said something to her on his way out, low and sharp, about consequences and timelines that she hadn't answered. She'd just watched him walk away. Ethan stood near the maintenance terminal 15 feet from the aircraft, watching Hutchins work. He didn't hover. He didn't offer opinions. He just waited the way he'd been waiting since midnight, with the particular stillness of a man who had already made his decision and was simply allowing the world to catch up to it. Hutchins ran the ultrasonic probe along the aft fuselage section. Slow, methodical. The equipment emitted a low, steady signal tone that echoed slightly in the hangar. His 2 assistants flanked him, both watching the readout screens. Nobody spoke. At 4:31, Hutchins stopped moving. He adjusted the probe angle. He looked at the screen. He moved the probe 2 centimeters. Looked again. He stood up. He looked at Ethan. And he didn't say anything yet. He didn't have to. Ethan read it in the way the man's shoulders dropped, not with relief, but with the particular weight that comes from confirming something you were hoping wasn't true. Hutchins walked over to where Victoria was sitting. She stood before he reached her. Ms. Sinclair, Hutchins said, the surface crack your technician identified extends approximately 18 centimeters into the primary frame structure. There is evidence of fatigue propagation consistent with repeated pressurization cycles, meaning this didn't happen tonight. It's been developing. He paused. If this aircraft had taken off. Tell me, Victoria said. Her voice was completely flat. At cruise altitude under normal cabin pressurization, in any significant turbulence event, the crack propagation rate would have accelerated dramatically. Best case, you'd have had a controlled emergency. Worst case. He stopped. He didn't finish it. He didn't need to. The hangar was so quiet that Ethan could hear the fluorescent lights humming 40 feet above his head. Kohler hadn't moved. He was still standing near the tail section, but his arms had come uncrossed at some point in the last 90 seconds, and now they just hung at his sides, and he was staring at the aircraft, the way a man stares at something he loves, after he realizes he almost destroyed it. Ray. Victoria's voice was quiet. She wasn't accusing him. She was just saying his name, and somehow that was worse. Kohler looked up. And for a moment, just a moment, Ethan saw 22 years of pride and competence and absolute certainty cross the man's face, and then dissolve into something raw and human and shaken. I didn't see it, Kohler said. I swear to God I didn't see it. I know, Victoria said. She turned and looked at Ethan. He was already looking at her. She held his gaze for 3 full seconds. Then she turned and walked toward the private lounge where Brandt was waiting, and her heels clicked against the hangar floor with each step, and when she pushed through the door, the sound cut off abruptly. Hutchins put his hand briefly on Ethan's shoulder. Good catch, he said. Just that. The professional version of everything that needed to be said. Ethan nodded. He looked at the aircraft one more time. 18 centimeters, not 4. 18. He'd been right, and he'd known he was right, and being right had never once felt like winning. He picked up his flashlight and his tool bag, and he walked out of the hangar to call Gerald and tell him the aircraft was officially grounded, pending full structural assessment. Outside, the Texas sky was turning gray-pink at the horizon, and the air smelled like jet fuel and early morning, and for a moment Ethan just stood in the parking lot next to his old truck and breathed. His phone buzzed. Ben. Dad. You up yet? He smiled, slow, tired, real. He typed back. Yeah, bud. On my way home. Did you fix the plane? He looked at his truck. He looked at the terminal building behind him. He thought about the crack in the metal 18 centimeters deep and the $40 million aircraft that was going to need weeks of structural repair before it went anywhere. Decided it needed more work, he typed. See you in 20. He got in the truck. The engine turned over on the second try the way it always did, reliable in its own stubborn way. He pulled out of the lot and onto the access road and let the morning come. He didn't know that inside the private lounge, Victoria Sinclair was having the worst conversation of her professional life. And he didn't know that conversation was about to become the most important one she'd ever had. Brandt had the controlled fury of a man who considered anger a luxury he couldn't afford, so he expressed it as something that looked like patience, but wasn't. Explain to me, he said, sitting with his hands folded on the table. The sequence of events that led to my team spending the night in an airport lounge in Texas because a maintenance worker decided to play engineer. That maintenance worker saved your life tonight, Victoria said. That is a very dramatic interpretation of 18 centimeters, she said. She set Hutchins' preliminary report on the table between them. She didn't push it toward him. She just set it there. The crack was 18 centimeters into the primary frame. The inspector's assessment is that catastrophic failure was a credible outcome. She looked at him. You were on the manifest, Henrik. Brandt looked at the report. He didn't touch it. For the first time tonight, something moved behind his eyes that wasn't calculation. The deal, he started. The deal can be rescheduled, Victoria said. You cannot. She paused. Neither can I. The room was very still. Then Brant reached out and picked up the report. He read it in silence for 4 minutes. Nobody in the room spoke. His 2 associates sat like fixtures. Victoria sat across from him with her hands around her coffee cup, and her face completely composed because she had learned a long time ago that the moment you showed a man like Brant that you were afraid you lost the only currency that mattered in a room like this. Brant set the report down. "Who is this man?" he said. "The technician." "His name is Ethan Carter. And why was he working as a night maintenance tech if his wife died?" Victoria said. Flat, simple, not for effect. 4 years ago, he left his career to raise his son. Brant absorbed that. His face did something complicated. He refused the money. Yes. Even knowing what it could. Yes. Brant looked at the report again. Then he looked at Victoria. And she saw for the first time something in his face that might have been respect not for her, or not only for her, but for the situation. For the particular kind of man who says money doesn't change metal and means every word of it. "Reschedule," Brant said. 2 weeks, and I want your full structural inspection report before we talk terms." He stood. "And I want to meet this man." "Carter." "Yes." He buttoned his jacket. "I want to shake the hand of someone who told me no." After they left, Victoria sat alone in the lounge for a long time. She was thinking about the photo she'd seen in Ethan's pocket, the boy with the gap in his teeth. She was thinking about the employment history on her phone, the gap, the career the papers published in journals that she'd had to Google because they were that far above her specialty. She was thinking about the way he'd looked at her when she offered him money. Not with contempt, not with superiority, just with a kind of steady, immovable calm that she hadn't seen in a very long time. She pulled up his employee file again. She scrolled to the section she'd skimmed before. Compensation. Title. Work schedule. Night shift. 5 days a week. The salary was, she stopped reading and looked at the ceiling for a moment, because the number was embarrassing, given what she now knew about who he was. What he was. She thought about what it cost, really cost, to choose this. To walk away from the career, from the title, from the publications. From the kind of professional identity that most men in her world would die before surrendering to. Walk away from all of it and show up at a private terminal at midnight in a worn jacket because someone needed a man who actually knew what he was doing. She thought about her own father who had died when she was 24 before she'd built anything worth showing him. Who had worked 2 jobs for most of her childhood and never once complained about it because that was what you did when you loved someone. She thought about Ethan Carter driving home in his old truck in the early morning to make breakfast for his 10-year-old son. She picked up her phone. "Marcus," she said when her assistant answered, "I need you to do something for me, and I need it done quietly." Back at the house, Ethan made eggs. Ben sat at the kitchen table with his hair still flat from sleep, a glass of orange juice in front of him, watching his father move around the stove with the alert, evaluating eyes of a child who had learned to read his parents' moods the way other children learn to read weather. "You look tired," Ben said. "I am tired. What happened?" "Found a problem with an airplane. Made sure it didn't fly." Ben considered this with the gravity of 10 years old. "Was it bad? The problem?" Ethan cracked 2 eggs into the pan. "Could have been. But you fixed it. Grounded it. Not quite the same thing. What's the difference?" Ethan thought about that for a moment. He thought about Hutchins' face when he stood up from the ultrasonic probe. He thought about Victoria Sinclair's voice saying 18 centimeters to Brant like she was reading from a casualty report. "Fixing it means the problem goes away," Ethan said. "Grounding it means the problem stays put until someone qualified addresses it properly." He slid the eggs onto a plate. "Sometimes keeping something still is the most important thing you can do." Ben nodded slowly, absorbing this with the seriousness he applied to most things. Then, "Did they say thank you?" Ethan set the plate in front of him. He thought about Victoria's face in the moment before she walked away. The 3 seconds she'd held his gaze. The specific quality of the silence. "Not yet," he said. He poured himself coffee and sat across from his son, and they ate breakfast in the morning light, without talking, which was one of the best things about them. They could be quiet together. Ben and Ethan without it, meaning anything bad. Some silences are just rest. This was one of those. Ethan was on his second cup of coffee when his phone rang. He glanced at the screen. Unknown number, local area code. He answered. "Mr. Carter, this is Marcus Webb, Executive Assistant to Victoria Sinclair. Ms. Sinclair would like to schedule a meeting with you at your earliest convenience." Ethan looked at his coffee. He looked at Ben, who was now drawing something in the margin of yesterday's homework. "Tell her I'm available after 5 today," Ethan said. "I work nights." "Of course. Ms. Sinclair's office downtown at 5:30. "Sure." He hung up. Ben looked up from his drawing. "Who was that?" "Work," Ethan said. "The airplane lady." He looked at his son. "Yeah, the airplane lady." Ben went back to his drawing. He was doing something with geometric shapes, triangles inside circles, the kind of absent pattern making that children do without knowing they're doing it. Ethan watched him for a moment, the furrow of the brows, the tongue between the teeth, and felt the familiar quiet weight of everything that had led them to this kitchen this morning. This particular silence. And 4 years ago, he had been standing in a different city, in a different life, in a conference room with 3 government contracts on the table, and a promotion that would have required relocation to Virginia, and his wife had just told him the diagnosis, and everything had changed in the time it took to say 2 words. Stage 4. And from that moment forward, nothing about the conference room, or the contracts, or the promotion had meant a single thing. There was only Sarah. And then there was only Sarah and Ben. And then there was only Ben. He didn't regret it. That was the thing people never quite believed when they looked at him, at the truck, at the jacket, at the modest life he'd constructed in the space where his career used to be. They assumed the sacrifice had cost him something. He mourned. They were wrong. What he'd given up was real, but what he'd kept was realer. Ben was drawing a plane now. Ethan could see the shape emerging wings, fuselage, tail section. The tail section. Ethan looked at it and felt something move through him, quiet and strange. A hairline. Diagonal. 4 centimeters on the surface. 18 below. He'd been right. He'd known he was right from the moment he saw it. And the rightness of it hadn't made him feel powerful or vindicated or any of the things that being right was supposed to make you feel. It had made him feel very, very tired. And also grateful. In the bone-deep, specific way that you are grateful when something terrible hasn't happened, when the plane is still on the ground, when everyone is still alive. "Dad," Ben said without looking up, "do you think you'll ever go back, like to the big engineering stuff?" Ethan looked at his son. The question landed carefully, the way Ben's questions always did, without fanfare, without performance. Just honest inquiry from a boy who was paying attention to more than anyone realized. "I don't know," Ethan said. "Would you want to?" Ethan turned his coffee cup in his hands. "I'd want to do something that mattered," he said finally. "I already do something that matters, so I don't know, bud. Maybe what matters is the work, not the title." Ben considered that with appropriate solemnity. "You saved a lot of people last night," he said. "Maybe." "Not maybe," Ben said. He looked up then, direct and certain, with his mother's eyes and his own unquestionable conviction. "You did." Ethan looked at his son for a long moment. "Get your backpack," he said. "You're going to be late." But he was smiling when he said it. And Ben saw it, and Ben smiled too, and the morning came in through the window, and the coffee was warm, and the eggs were gone. And for a few minutes in that kitchen, everything was exactly what it needed to be. At 5:28, Ethan Carter parked his old truck on the street outside Sinclair Aerospace's downtown office building. He sat in the cab for a moment, looking at the glass facade, the logo above the entrance. the kind of building that cost more per square foot than he made in a year. He reached into his breast pocket and touched the edge of Ben's photo. Just touched it. Then he got out of the truck and walked in. He was still wearing his work jacket. He hadn't thought to change. Or maybe he had thought about it and decided not to, for reasons he didn't fully articulate, even to himself. The receptionist looked at him the way people looked at him in places like this. The evaluating glance. The half-second calculation. She was professional enough to move past it quickly. "Ethan Carter for Ms. Sinclair," he said. "Of course, Mr. Carter. She's expecting you." He rode the elevator to the 14th floor and was met by Marcus Webb, a young man in a sharp suit who shook his hand with genuine warmth and walked him through a corridor lined with aerospace photographs and industry awards and the particular artifacts of a company that was very proud of what it had built. He was shown into a corner office with large windows. Victoria Sinclair was standing when he entered. Not behind her desk, standing in the middle of the room, as if she'd positioned herself that way deliberately. As if sitting behind a desk was a distance she didn't want between them today. She looked different than she had in the hangar. Still sharp, still composed, but something had shifted in the composure. It was softer now, or less armored, which wasn't quite the same thing as soft. "Mr. Carter," she said. "Thank you for coming." "Ms. Sinclair," he said. They looked at each other across the office, and then she said something he hadn't expected. "I owe you an apology," she said. "Not as a professional courtesy, as a person." She held his gaze. "I dismissed you the moment you walked into that hangar. I heard what I expected to hear from someone who looked the way you look and drove what you drive, and I almost let that cost everyone their lives." She paused. "That's on me. Not on Kohler, not on Brandt, not on any of the circumstances. That's a failure I own." The room was very quiet. Ethan looked at her. He thought about what it cost a person to say that. Really say it without hedging, without the passive constructions that let you apologize while technically not admitting to anything. He knew what that kind of statement cost because he'd had to make a few of them himself in his life. "I appreciate that," he said, simply, without performance. She nodded, and then she said, "I have an offer I'd like you to consider." He stood very still. "Not the money," she said quickly. "I know what you think of the money, and you're right." She moved to her desk, picked up a folder, held it without opening it. "I want to build something. A safety division dedicated entirely to structural integrity, inspection protocols technician. Training the kind of systematic approach that catches problems before they become the thing you caught last night." She looked at him. "I want you to lead it." Ethan said nothing. "I know that's not why you came back to work," she said. "I know what you gave up, and I know why you gave it up. I'm not asking you to be the man you were before." She set the folder on the desk between them like an offering, not a negotiation. "I'm asking you to be the man you are right now, because that man is exactly what this company needs." The folder sat on the desk. Ethan looked at it. He thought about 18 centimeters and Hutchins's face, and Ben drawing an airplane at the kitchen table. He thought about stage 4 and linoleum floors and the particular sound of his truck's engine turning over on the second try every morning. He thought about the crack. He didn't reach for the folder yet. But he didn't walk away either. The folder sat between them like a question neither of them had answered yet. Ethan looked at it. Victoria looked at him. And the office was quiet in that particular downtown way, muffled traffic 14 floors below the soft hum of climate control, the distant sound of someone's phone ringing in another room and being answered quickly. He didn't reach for the folder. "I need to think about it," he said. "Baye." Victoria didn't push. That surprised him slightly. He'd half expected the sales pitch, the compensation package, the title, the corner office, the whole architecture of persuasion that people in her position deployed when they wanted something. Instead, she just nodded once, like she'd expected exactly this answer, and had already decided to respect it. Take your time, she said. The offer doesn't expire. He picked up the folder. Not opening it, just taking it. A gesture that meant something without committing to anything. He rode the elevator back down alone. He stood in the lobby for a moment, folder under his arm, looking through the glass doors at his truck parked on the street outside. The cracked mirror on the passenger side caught the late afternoon sun at a particular angle and threw a small, bright diamond of light onto the sidewalk. He pushed through the door and walked to the truck and sat in it without starting the engine for a full 3 minutes. Then he drove home. Ben was at the kitchen table again. Homework again. Different subject history this time, a worksheet about the Revolutionary War that he was filling out with the focused efficiency of a boy who wanted to finish before his father got home. He looked up when Ethan came in. "You changed your mind about the jacket," Ben said. Ethan looked down at himself. He was still wearing the work jacket. "No, I didn't." "Okay." Ben looked at the folder. "What's that?" "Something I need to think about." "Good thing or bad thing?" Ethan set the folder on the counter. He opened the refrigerator. He stared into it for a moment the way people stare into refrigerators when they're not actually thinking about food. "I genuinely don't know yet," he said. Ben seemed to accept this as a complete answer. He went back to the Revolutionary War. Ethan closed the refrigerator. He picked up the folder. He sat down at the table across from his son, opened it, and started reading. The offer was more than he'd expected. Not just financially, though. The financial component was significant enough that he had to read it twice to make sure he hadn't misread the comma placement. What surprised him was the scope. This wasn't a token position, a title without authority, the kind of thing companies create to absorb talented people and then gradually neutralize them. Victoria had structured this as a genuine division with real budget, real reporting authority, real power to ground aircraft mandate inspections, develop protocols, and this was the part that made him stop and set the folder down for a moment, train the next generation of structural inspectors. She wasn't offering him a job. She was offering him the thing he would have built if his life had gone differently. He sat with that for a while. Ben finished his worksheet, turned it face down with the satisfaction of a completed task, and looked at his father. "Dad," he said, "you have the face." "What face?" "The one where you're working something out but you don't want to say it yet." Ethan looked at his son, 10 years old and reading him like a book. Sarah had been the same way, that particular attentiveness, that quality of paying full attention without making you feel examined. "I might have a chance to do something bigger," Ethan said, "with the work." Ben waited. "It would mean changing things. Schedule. Maybe other things." He paused. "It would mean being less available during the day." Ben considered this with genuine seriousness. Like less breakfast. Maybe. But still dinner. Always dinner. Ben looked at the worksheet. He looked at the refrigerator. He looked at his father with Sarah's eyes, and his own uncluttered judgment. "Dad," he said, "I'm 10. I'm not going to be 10 forever. You can do things. It's okay." He paused. Mom would say the same thing. The kitchen was very quiet. Ethan looked at the folder on the table. He thought about 18 centimeters and a plane full of people and a tiny crack that everyone else had missed. He thought about what it meant to be the only person in a room who was looking at the right thing. He closed the folder. "Finish your water," he said. "We're getting burgers." Ben grinned, gap-toothed, immediate, exactly like his mother. "I knew you had the face," he said. 3 days passed before Ethan called Victoria's office. In those 3 days, he read the folder 4 times, walked the block twice at 10 p.m. Because he thought better when he moved, called his sister in Phoenix, who told him he was an idiot if he didn't take it, and spent one long Tuesday night at the airport doing his regular maintenance rounds with the particular heightened attention of a man who was reconsidering the dimensions of his own life. On the 4th morning he called. Marcus Webb picked up. "Ms. Sinclair's office." This is Ethan Carter. I'd like to speak with her. 30 seconds of hold music. Then Victoria's voice direct and awake, like she'd been expecting this call. Carter? I have conditions, he said. A pause. Go ahead. The division operates independently. I report to you directly, not through legal or compliance or any intermediary. If I ground an aircraft, it stays grounded until I clear it personally. No override from operations, no override from clients, no exceptions. Agreed. I want the authority to mandate training for all maintenance staff, not optional, mandatory, and I want a probationary inspection protocol for any aircraft that hasn't had a structural NDT assessment in the previous 18 months. That's going to create significant cost pressure. I know, he said. Is that a no? She didn't answer immediately. He could hear her thinking the specific quality of a sharp person deciding how much they actually meant what they said. That's a yes, she said, with a 12-month phase-in on the inspection protocol. 6 months. Another pause. Shorter this time. 9. Final offer. Deal, he said. Anything else? He thought for a moment. I want the title to reflect the actual function, not Director of Safety Initiatives or VP of Quality Excellence or whatever the standard language is. I want Structural Safety Director, because that's what it is. Victoria made a sound that might have been a surprised laugh, short, genuine, involuntary. Done, she said. When can you start? 2 weeks. I need to give proper notice on the night shift. Gerald covered for me when it mattered. I'm not leaving him without coverage. 2 weeks, she agreed. And then, Carter, for what it's worth, I'm glad you called. For what it's worth, he said, so am I. Meh. He hung up. He looked at his kitchen, the linoleum floor, the refrigerator that hummed too loud, the table where Ben did homework every evening. He'd said yes to something. He hadn't said yes to many things in 4 years. It felt strange and right in equal measure the way most true things do. What Ethan didn't know and wouldn't know until the following Monday was that Victoria Sinclair had already made 2 other phone calls in the 3 days he'd spent making his decision. The first was to Dale Hutchins, asking him to compile a formal incident report on the Gulfstream inspection, a document that would ultimately be submitted to the FAA as a voluntary safety disclosure. The second call was more complicated. The second call was to Brandt. Brandt had asked to meet Ethan Carter. Victoria had said she'd arrange it. She hadn't mentioned it to Ethan because she hadn't decided yet whether to, and she wasn't entirely certain Brandt's interest was benign, and she admitted this to herself in the particular honesty of midnight, thinking, protective. Of Ethan Carter, and what he was in the specific way, you become protective of things that are genuinely rare. But Brandt was Brandt, and the deal was the deal. And on the Monday that Ethan Carter walked into the Sinclair Aerospace building as its new structural safety director, Henrik Brandt, was already in the conference room. Ethan didn't know that when he stepped off the elevator. Marcus met him in the corridor. Good morning, Mr. Carter. Miss Sinclair asked me to bring you to the main conference room first. First? Ethan looked at him. Before what? Marcus had the expression of a man who had been asked not to say the thing he was about to have to not say. She'd like to explain in person. Ethan followed him down the corridor and through the conference room door and stopped. Brandt was at the head of the table. His 2 associates flanked him. Victoria was standing to the side, and her expression, when she saw Ethan's face, was complex, apologetic, and composed simultaneously, the expression of someone who had made a calculated decision and was prepared to defend it. Ray Kohler was there too. That was the part Ethan hadn't expected. Kohler was sitting at the far end of the table, not in the power position, just present. He was in a suit instead of his flight gear, and he looked like a man who had been not sleeping well for several days, which was probably accurate. Brandt stood when Ethan entered. Mr. Carter, he said. He extended his hand. Ethan looked at it for 1 second, then he shook it. "Mr. Brandt," he said, "please sit." Brandt gestured as if the conference room were his, which in some functional sense, given the investment he was considering, it temporarily was. "I asked Ms. Sinclair to arrange this. I apologize if it was sprung on you." "It was," Ethan said. He sat down. He set the folder he was carrying on the table, his own folder, the offer letter and condition agreements, the material for his first day, and he looked at Brandt with the same patient steadiness he'd looked at him with in the hangar 4 nights ago. "What can I do for you?" Brandt studied him for a moment. The particular appraisal of a man who made his living assessing value accurately. "I want to understand something," he said. "In the hangar, when Ms. Sinclair offered you a significant sum to clear the aircraft." He paused. "You said no." "Yes." "Why?" The room was quiet. Victoria was watching Ethan. Kohler was watching the table. "Because the plane wasn't safe," Ethan said. "But the money. The money wasn't the point," Ethan said. "The plane wasn't safe. Those are separate facts. One doesn't change the other." Brandt looked at him for a long moment. "Most people," he said carefully, "find a way to make those facts feel connected when the number is large enough." "I know," Ethan said. "But not you. Not me." And Brandt leaned back. He looked at Victoria. He looked at Kohler. He looked at Ethan one more time. And then he did something that no one in the room had seen him do in 3 days of high-stakes negotiation and boardroom performance. He smiled. A real one. Small and genuine, and slightly uncomfortable, like a man who didn't wear that expression often, and was aware of it. "I was on that aircraft's manifest," Brandt said. "My name, Seat 2A. He paused. "I owe you my life, Mr. Carter. I want you to understand that I understand that." "You don't owe me anything," Ethan said. "I was doing my job." "Yes," Brandt said. "That's exactly what I mean." Kohler made a sound at the far end of the table. Not a word, just a sound. The kind of sound that happens when something has been sitting in your chest for several days and a single exchange of sentences releases some of the pressure. Everyone looked at him. Kohler looked at Ethan. His jaw was set, but his eyes were different from what they'd been in the hangar. Not defensive, now. Not armored with 22 years of professional certainty. Just direct. Honest. The expression of a man who had decided to stop protecting himself from something. "I owe you an apology," Kohler said. "Not a professional one, a real one." Ethan looked at him. "I laughed at you," Kohler said. "In the hangar, when you called the grounding. I had 22 years and a perfect record, and I was certain you were wrong, and I laughed." He paused. "My pre-flight checklist didn't catch it. The inspection my crew ran at 6 p.m. didn't catch it. You caught it." He stopped again. The words were clearly costing him something, and he was paying the cost anyway. "I've been flying for 22 years, and I almost put people in a plane with an 18-centimeter fracture in the primary frame because I was too sure of myself to look where you were looking." The room was very still. "Ray," Ethan said. Kohler looked at him. "I know a lot of pilots with perfect safety records," Ethan said. "You know how they got them. Not because they never made mistakes, because they were surrounded by people who caught the mistakes before they became something else." He paused. "The system worked last night, badly and slowly, and with too much argument, but it worked. That's what I want to build here. A better version of that system." Kohler absorbed this. He nodded once, tight-controlled, a military sort of nod. "I'd like to be part of it," he said. "If that's possible." Victoria, from her position against the wall, looked at Ethan. Ethan looked at Kohler for a moment, thinking about the man who had laughed, thinking about the man who had shown up tonight in a suit and said the true thing, even though it cost him. "Talk to me after the meeting," Ethan said. Something in Kohler's posture released. Not much, but enough to see. Brandt cleared his throat. He opened his own folder, the Meridian investment terms rescheduled and revised. "Now," he said, and his voice had shifted into the register of actual business, the mode he was most comfortable in. I would like to discuss the terms of the partnership contingent on a full structural inspection of the Gulf Stream and your new director's sign-off on the fleet safety protocol. He looked at Ethan. I assume you have no objection to being included in due diligence. That's literally the job, Ethan said. Brant smiled again, smaller this time, but warmer. Good, he said. Then let's get to work. The meeting ran 2.5 hours. What Ethan had expected to be a first-day orientation turned into something closer to a working session. Brant's team raising specific concerns about the Sinclair fleet maintenance records, Ethan working through each one with the particular methodical clarity of someone who had spent years reducing complex structural questions to their fundamental components.
잠시만.
He was in his element. He hadn't been in his element in 4 years, and the feeling was disorienting in the way that returning to something you love always is partly unfamiliar, partly like coming home. The two sensations occupying the same space simultaneously.
야,
Victoria watched him work and thought about the folder that had sat on her desk for 3 days. She thought about the way he'd taken it without opening it. She thought about the conditions he'd listed on the phone call, specific and non-negotiable, in the tone of someone who knew exactly what they needed and was prepared to walk away if they didn't get it. She thought about her father again briefly and then away. At noon, the meeting broke. Brant and his associates went to lunch. Victoria's CFO took a call in the corridor. Kohler waited. Ethan and Kohler ended up standing near the conference room window, not quite at the window, not quite in the room, a middle space that had something liminal about it. Tell me something, Kohler said, not hostile, genuinely asking. When you saw the crack, were you certain, or was there part of you that thought, maybe I'm wrong, maybe I'm reading this wrong? Ethan thought about it honestly, the way he thought about most things. There was a part of me, he said, that knew what it meant structurally. That part had no doubt. He paused. There was another part of me that's been a maintenance tech for 5 years, and knew everyone in that room was going to push back hard. He looked at Kohler. I was certain about the metal. I wasn't certain about what would happen when I said something. Kohler nodded slowly. And you said it anyway, he said. Yeah, because of the boy, Kohler said. It wasn't a question. He'd seen the photo too that night in the hangar the same way Victoria had. The kid in your pocket. Ethan was quiet for a moment. Partly, he said. But not the way you might think. It wasn't about setting an example or doing the right thing for him to see. He stopped. He looked out toward the corridor where Marcus was walking past with a tablet and 2 cups of coffee. It was more like if I'm the person I need to be for him, then I have to be that person everywhere, not just at home, not just when it's easy. He paused. You can't be honest with your kid on Tuesday and dishonest about a cracked airframe on Wednesday. It doesn't work that way. Kohler was quiet for a long time. Then, I have a daughter, he said. 17. She wants to be a pilot. Does she know what she's getting into? Ethan asked. She knows more than I did at her age, Kohler said. And there was something in his voice, pride and tenderness, and the particular complexity of a parent watching their child become a person. She's going to be better at it than me, already has better instincts. Then make sure she's surrounded by people who'll tell her the truth when it matters, Ethan said. That's the whole job at the end of it. Tell the truth about the metal. Kohler looked at him. And for the first time since the hangar, there was nothing between them. No professional hierarchy, no resentment, no defensiveness. Just 2 men standing near a window, talking honestly. Yeah, Kohler said. Yeah, I think that's right. Victoria came back into the room. She looked at the 2 of them together, and something moved across her face. Relief maybe, or something adjacent to it. The particular look of someone who has been holding a complicated situation in tension for several days and has just watched 2 of its components resolve. Lunch, she said. Ethan picked up his folder. I should check in with the maintenance team. I want to review the inspection protocols before end of day. Victoria blinked. It's your first day. That's why I want to do it today, he said. Before I know where everything is, I'll look at it with the same eyes I used last Thursday. After I know where everything is. He shrugged. Things stop being visible when they're familiar. She looked at him for a moment with an expression he couldn't quite read, something between exasperated and impressed, and something else that didn't have a clean name. I'll have Marcus show you the maintenance records room, she said. Appreciate it. He turned toward the door, then stopped. He turned back. Ms. Sinclair? Victoria, she said. Please, you can call me Victoria. He considered that. Victoria. He paused. Thank you for building something worth protecting. She didn't have an answer for that. It wasn't the kind of thing that invited a corporate response or a professional deflection. It was just a true thing said plainly by a man in a work jacket who had spent 4 years being invisible and had spent one night refusing to be. She stood in the conference room after he left and held the quiet of it. Outside in the corridor, she could hear Ethan asking Marcus about the filing system for maintenance records, Practical Direct already working, already making the thing better. She looked at the chair he'd been sitting in. She thought about the Gulfstream sitting in the hangar, grounded and still and waiting for the work to be done properly. She thought about everything that hadn't happened. She sat down in the chair right there at the head of the conference table, and for a moment she didn't perform anything. She didn't manage anything. She just sat with the full weight of what the last 4 days had been, and what they'd almost been, and how the entire difference between those two things was a man no one had thought to look at finding a crack that no one else had thought to find. Her phone buzzed. Brant. A message. Due diligence timeline confirmed. Looking forward to working with your new director. She looked at the message. She looked at the door Ethan had walked through. She typed back, so am I. The maintenance records room was exactly what Ethan had expected, and worse than he'd hoped. Marcus showed him in at noon and left him with a keycard, a password to the digital filing system, and an apologetic look that said everything the young man was too professional to say out loud. 3 filing cabinets. 2 desktop terminals. A shelf of binders going back 11 years. Some of them organized by tail number, some by date, some by a system that appeared to have been invented by someone who no longer worked there and never explained their logic to anyone who did. Ethan sat down. He opened the first terminal. He started reading. He was still reading at 4:30 when Victoria knocked on the open door. She looked at the stack of files he'd pulled, the legal pad next to the keyboard covered in his handwriting, the 2 empty coffee cups from the break room down the hall. You didn't take a lunch break, she said. I ate at the desk, he said, which was technically true. Marcus had brought him a sandwich at 1:15, and he'd consumed it without looking away from the screen. She came in. She looked at the legal pad. What am I looking at? 11 aircraft. 6 of them haven't had a full structural NDT assessment in over 20 months. He turned the pad so she could read it. 2 of those 6 have logged over 400 pressurization cycles since their last inspection. He paused. That's a problem. Victoria looked at the numbers. Her face did something controlled and careful. How urgent? I want those 2 grounded by end of week for full inspection. The other 4 on a schedule within 30 days. He looked at her. I know what that means operationally. It means a significant disruption to... I know what it means, he said again, not unkindly. I'm telling you anyway. Then she held his gaze, and in her eyes he could see the same calculation she'd been running in the hangar 4 nights ago, the cost on one side, the risk on the other, the decision that only she could make. End of week, she said. Get me the formal grounding orders, and I'll notify operations. He nodded. She started to leave, then stopped. Carter? Ethan? She turned back. How long do you think this has been building the inspection gap? He thought about it honestly. Minimum 2 years. Probably longer. It's not negligence. It's the kind of thing that happens gradually when you're growing fast, and your compliance team is reactive instead of proactive. He paused. Nobody did anything wrong exactly. Nobody did enough right. She absorbed that. That's what I'm here to fix, he said. She left. He went back to the files. By Thursday of that first week, the first grounding order had been issued. Aircraft tail number N471 SXA Bombardier. Challenger 350, that had been running client flights 3 days a week, was pulled from service pending inspection. The operations manager, a compact, efficient woman named Sandra Reeves, who had been with the company 7 years and had seen 3 CEOs come and go, appeared in the doorway of Ethan's office at 8:15 that morning with a specific expression on her face. "Mr. Carter," she said in the tone of someone who has chosen their words with surgical care, "I have 6 bookings for N471SX through the end of next week. High-priority clients. 2 of them are repeat customers that Ms. Sinclair has personally cultivated." "I understand," Ethan said. "The inspection will take 3 to 5 days minimum depending on what we find." He looked at her. "What alternative aircraft do we have available?" Sandra blinked. She'd come prepared for an argument, and he'd skipped past it entirely. "The G550 is available through Tuesday. Substitute it for the priority bookings through Tuesday. For the bookings after that, I need a list by noon, and we'll work through the alternatives together." He paused. "I'm not trying to create problems for your team, Sandra. I'm trying to make sure we don't have a bigger problem later." Sandra looked at him for a moment, with the evaluating expression of someone revising a first impression. "I'll have the list to you by 11:30, she said. "Appreciate it," he said. She left. He turned back to his desk. The second grounding order went out Friday afternoon. That one created more noise. The aircraft, a Gulfstream G45. Oh, that had been the preferred transport of one of Sinclair's largest client accounts, a pharmaceutical executive named Lawrence Hayward, who had very specific opinions about schedule disruptions, generated a phone call to Victoria's cell within 2 hours of the notification. Ethan was in a meeting with his newly assigned inspection coordinator when Victoria appeared in the doorway and gestured for him with the particular economy of motion of someone managing 3 things simultaneously. He excused himself. "Hayward," she said the moment they were in the corridor. "I figured. He's threatening to take his account to Atlantic Charter." "Okay," Ethan said. Victoria looked at him. "That's a $400,000 annual contract, Carter." "I know." He met her eyes. "Is that aircraft going to fly this week?" She held the look for 3 full seconds. Then, "No, it's not." "Then I'm not sure there's anything else to talk about." She made a sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite a sigh, but lived in the same neighborhood as both. She put her phone to her ear and walked back toward her office. And as she passed him, he heard her say into the phone, "Lawrence, I understand your frustration completely. Let me tell you what we found." He went back to his meeting. What happened next was the thing nobody had predicted, including Ethan. Hayward presented with the actual inspection findings on his preferred aircraft a stress concentration at a wing root fitting that Ethan's team identified during the NDT assessment not as severe as the Gulfstream G700 crack, but real documented requiring repair didn't pull his account. He called Victoria on Tuesday morning and asked for a meeting. He showed up that afternoon with his chief of staff and sat across from Victoria and Ethan in the conference room and said with the directness of a man who had built a pharmaceutical empire on risk management, "I want to understand your new inspection protocol, all of it." Ethan walked him through it for 40 minutes. Technical specific, no softening. Hayward asked better questions than Ethan had expected. Good questions, the kind that came from someone who understood systems and failure modes even in a different industry. But at the end, Hayward looked at Victoria. "You hired the right person," he said. "I've been flying private for 12 years. Nobody has ever grounded my aircraft and explained why in a way that made me feel like someone was actually paying attention." He paused. I'm renewing for 2 years. Fixed rate. Victoria, to her considerable credit, kept her face completely composed until Hayward left the room. Then she sat down in her chair and let out a long, slow breath. "Okay," she said. "Okay." "It won't always go that way," Ethan said. "I know." She looked up at him. But today it did. He was already heading for the door. "I have an inspection at 3. Carter." He stopped. "Good work." He nodded once and left. The weeks accumulated. October turned cold in that particular Texas way that feels like an argument rather than a season. Warm by noon, genuinely cold by 8, the weather unable to commit. Ethan settled into a rhythm that was different from the one he'd had before, wider in some ways, more demanding in others, but with the same foundation underneath it. Morning with Ben. Drop-off. Work. Pickup. Dinner. Homework. The ordinary machinery of a life that mattered. Ben noticed the difference before Ethan could name it. "You come home not tired," Ben said one evening, pushing pasta around his plate with the consideration of a 10-year-old conducting research. "I come home tired," Ethan said. "Different tired," Ben said. "Before you were tired like the work was heavy. Now you're tired like you ran a good race." Ethan looked at his son. This child who observed everything and said only the necessary portion of what he understood. "Yeah," Ethan said, "that's about right." "Is it because of the lady, the CEO?" "It's because of the work," Ethan said. "The lady gave me the room to do the work. That's different." Ben considered the distinction with appropriate seriousness. "Is she nice?" "She's complicated," Ethan said. "She's working on being better." "Like everyone," Ben said. "Like everyone," Ethan agreed. The twist that Ethan hadn't seen coming arrived on a Wednesday morning in November, 6 weeks into his tenure, in the form of a phone call from Dale Hutchins. "Ethan." Hutchins's voice was careful in the way that experienced men are careful when they're about to say something they've thought about twice. "You remember the voluntary disclosure report we filed with the FAA on the G700 incident?" "Of course. It's been flagged for a formal review." A pause. "Not on Sinclair. On the manufacturer. The FAA's analysis of the fracture pattern suggests the crack wasn't just a maintenance oversight. The propagation signature and the location are consistent with a design characteristic in that specific frame section on early G700 production runs." Ethan went very still. "How many aircraft?" he said. "They're looking at a production window of about 60 units, early builds delivered between 2 and 4 years ago." Another pause. "Ethan, if this tracks the way the FAA thinks it does, that is a fleet-wide issue, not a Sinclair issue." 60 aircraft. Ethan did the math quickly, involuntarily, the way engineers do. 60 aircraft average capacity, typical flight hours per week. "Has the FAA issued anything public yet?" he said. "Not yet. They wanted me to reach out to you directly first, off the record." Hutchins' voice was steady. "They want to know if you'd be willing to consult on the technical review, given that you're the one who found it first." The phone felt very heavy in his hand. "I need to talk to Victoria," he said. "I figured you'd say that. Call me back by end of day if you can." He hung up. He sat at his desk for 30 seconds. Then he walked down the corridor to Victoria's office and knocked. She was on a call. She looked at his face through the glass wall and ended the call before he'd finished knocking. "What happened?" she said the moment he was through the door. He told her. He watched her absorb it. The controlled face, the specific stillness of someone whose mind was moving very fast. She didn't interrupt. She didn't react until he was done. Then, 60 aircraft, she said. "Approximate. FAA is still working the numbers." "And they want you to consult?" "Yes." She stood up. She walked to the window, not to look out, just to move, which was what she did when she was thinking at full speed. "If this is what the FAA thinks it is, and it becomes public..." "It'll become public regardless," he said. Question is whether it becomes public as a crisis or as a managed safety action. She turned. And the difference is, who talks first, how the information gets framed, whether the industry looks at this as a systemic failure that got caught too late or as a systemic risk that got identified and addressed. He paused. We're in a position most companies never get. We found it first. We grounded the plane. We filed the disclosure voluntarily. We are on the right side of this, Victoria. That matters more than you might think. She held his gaze. You've been here 6 weeks, she said. I know. And you're about to walk into an FAA technical review that could reshape safety protocols for a significant portion of the business aviation fleet. If they'll have me, he said. They'll have you, she said. They called you first. She sat back down. She looked at him with the expression that had evolved over 6 weeks from complicated to something cleaner, something more like the trust you extend to someone who has earned it incrementally and without fanfare. What do you need from me? Legal counsel in the room when I call Hutchins back, he said. And I need Sandra to flag any G700 bookings in our client schedule for the next 60 days. Quietly. Done. What else? He thought about it for a moment. Tell Kohler. He should know. He was in the cockpit of that aircraft for the pre-flight. He needs to understand what we think was happening before he ever got there. Victoria blinked. Ray, it wasn't his fault, Ethan said. And I want him to hear that clearly from this officially. Not because it makes him feel better, because it's true, and people should know the true thing. He paused. And because I want him working with my team on the inspector training program, and I need him whole for that. She looked at him for a long moment. You know, she said, most people in your position would be thinking about what this does for their career. I'm thinking about 60 aircraft, he said. She picked up her phone to call legal. I know, she said. That's why I hired you. The call with Hutchins was at 3 p.m. Legal counsel on one side of the table, Victoria on the other, Ethan with the phone on speaker and his legal pad in front of him. The same legal pad that had started this new chapter of his life with 6 grounding orders and was now filling up with something larger. Hutchins walked them through the FAA's preliminary findings. The fracture propagation signature, the frame section geometry, the production window, the preliminary list of tail numbers. The formal airworthiness directive is probably 6 to 8 weeks out, Hutchins said. They want the technical review done first. They want someone who's seen this crack in the field and can speak to it with first-hand knowledge. A pause. Ethan, you're the only person who's looked this particular crack in the face and told it no. The room was quiet. I'll do it, Ethan said. Good. Hutchins' voice relaxed slightly. The review panel is in Washington, 2 weeks from now. I'll send the details to... He paused. Who should I send them to? Ethan looked at Victoria. She was already reaching for her notepad. Send them to me directly, Ethan said. And to Ms. Sinclair's office as secondary. Done. A beat. Ethan, what you caught that night, it's going to matter more than you know. After the call ended, the room stayed quiet for a moment. The legal counsel was writing. Victoria was looking at the table. Then she looked up. Washington, she said. 2 weeks, he said. Ben. The question surprised him that she'd thought of it, that she'd said it before the logistical questions. He looked at her. My sister in Phoenix. She can come stay. Victoria nodded. Then, I'm coming too. Victoria. It's my company's aircraft, my voluntary disclosure, my new director presenting findings to a federal review panel. She held his gaze. I'm not sending you into that room alone. He thought about arguing. He weighed it for about 3 seconds. Okay, he said. She nodded. Good. He picked up his legal pad and walked to the door. He stopped without quite turning back, more of a pause, a stillness. Victoria. Yes, That night in the hangar, when I said money doesn't change metal. He paused. I want you to know I wasn't judging you. You were trying to save something you built. I understand that. She was quiet for a moment. I know, she said. But I was wrong. You were scared, he said. There's a difference. He walked out. She sat at the table after he left alone in the conference room with the case files and the legal pad and the empty chair where he'd been sitting, and she thought about the difference between wrong and scared, and how much it mattered whether someone could see that line clearly. She thought about the folder she'd pushed across the desk to him 3 weeks ago, the conditions he'd listed on the phone, the work jacket he still wore sometimes on inspection days, as if he needed to remember where he'd come from in order to know where he was going. She thought about 60 aircraft somewhere in the air above the country right now, and one man in an office down the hall who had looked at the right place at the right time and refused to be talked out of what he saw. Che. Outside in the corridor, she could hear Ethan on the phone again, his voice steady and clear, explaining something technical to someone on the other end who was asking good questions. Already working, always working. Not for the title or the salary or the vindication, but for the same reason he'd stood in that hangar at 2 a.m, refusing to clear a broken aircraft. Because the work was real. Because the metal didn't lie. Because someone had to look. She gathered her files. She had a company to run, and a Washington trip to prepare for, and 6 client calls to return, and a board meeting Thursday morning that was going to require every bit of composure she possessed. She stood up. She straightened her jacket. She walked back to her office, feeling for the first time in a long time like the thing she was building was worth exactly what it had cost her. The flight to Washington left at 7:15 on a Tuesday morning. Not on a Sinclair aircraft. Ethan had flagged that without being asked, the optics of flying to a federal safety review on a company plane felt wrong to him in a way he couldn't fully articulate, but didn't need to. Victoria had agreed without argument, which told him something about how far they'd both traveled from the hangar. They sat across the aisle from each other on the commercial flight. Victoria had a briefing folder open on her tray table within 5 minutes of takeoff. Ethan had his legal pad. Neither of them talked much for the first hour, which was comfortable in the specific way that silences become comfortable between people who have spent 6 weeks in the same building, making hard decisions. Somewhere over Arkansas, Victoria said without looking up from her folder, "Tell me what to expect in the room." "Federal Review Panel," Ethan said. "Probably 6 to 8 people. FAA engineers, a structural specialist or 2, possibly someone from the manufacturer's side, though they'll be in defensive posture and you should expect that. The tone will be technical, but the stakes are political, because any airworthiness directive on 60 aircraft is a significant industry event. And your role, technical witness, factual account of what I found, how I found it, what the subsequent inspection revealed, and my assessment of the fracture propagation signature." He paused. "They'll push on the findings. That's their job. I'll push back. That's mine." She looked at him. "Are you nervous?" He thought about it. "No." "Why not?" "Because I know what I saw," he said. Simply, without performance. "I've known what I saw since 2:17 in the morning on a Thursday in October. Everything since then has been other people catching up to a thing that was already true." She looked at him for a moment. Then back to her folder. "I want you to know something," she said. Her voice had shifted less CEO, more person. "Before the review, in case it doesn't come up later in a way that feels right to say." She paused. "I spent the first 4 years of building this company being afraid. Not publicly, but in the real way, the 3 a.m. way. Afraid that one bad decision would unravel everything. Afraid that I'd built something that looked solid, but had a crack I couldn't see." She stopped. "And then a man I dismissed in under 60 seconds found an actual crack, a real one, in a $40 million aircraft, and refused to be moved by anything I offered him." She looked at him directly. "You didn't just save lives that night. You showed me what it looks like when someone is absolutely certain of something real. I hadn't seen that in a long time. Ethan looked at his legal pad. He looked at the back of the seat in front of him. He thought about Sarah, who had been absolutely certain of things the way Victoria was describing quietly, completely, without needing anyone else to validate it. My wife was like that, he said. She knew. It was the first time he'd mentioned her directly unprompted in a professional context since he'd left his career. He noticed that as he said it, noticed that it didn't hurt the way it used to. It hurt differently now, softer, more like memory than wound. She sounds remarkable, Victoria said. She was the most honest person I ever knew, Ethan said. And I worked with engineers who had PhDs and government clearances and 30 years of experience. She was still the most honest person I ever knew. He paused. She could look at a situation and tell you exactly what was true about it. Not harsh, just clear. The way good metal is clear, no ambiguity in the grain. Victoria was quiet. Ben has it too, he said. That clarity. He gets it from her. The plane descended into the gray of a November Washington morning. They didn't talk again until they were in the terminal, moving through the crowd toward ground transportation, and Victoria said, "Whatever happens in that room today, I want you to know I'm proud to be in it with you." He looked at her. She was looking straight ahead, moving with the purposeful efficiency of someone who'd learned to navigate airports the way other people navigate conversations. "Thank you," he said. She nodded once. They walked out into the cold. The review panel was in a federal building 3 blocks from the FAA headquarters. Conference room, 4th floor, 7 people around an oval table when Ethan and Victoria walked in at 9:50. Dale Hutchins was already there, seated halfway down the table, and he gave Ethan a nod that carried the weight of everything they'd discussed on the phone, and more. The panel chair was a woman named Dr. Elaine Marsh, no relation to Gerald the dispatcher, though Ethan noted the coincidence privately. She was late 50s, gray-haired, with the particular economy of expression that comes from years of reading technical reports and listening to people tell her things that were either true or weren't. She introduced the panel. FAA structural engineers, a fatigue specialist from a university research program. One man from the manufacturer's legal team, who introduced himself as Robert Kiley and sat with his hands folded on a notepad in the careful posture of someone whose job was to say as little as possible while absorbing as much as possible. Dr. Marsh looked at Ethan. "Mr. Carter, the panel has reviewed your incident report and the subsequent inspection findings submitted by Mr. Hutchins. We'd like you to walk us through the discovery in your own words, beginning with your initial observation." Ethan opened his legal pad. He talked for 22 minutes without interruption. The panel listened. Kylie's pen moved twice, then stopped. Dr. Marsh's expression didn't change, but her eyes did sharper as he described the fracture angle, sharper again when he reached the ultrasonic findings. When he finished, the room was quiet for a moment. Then the fatigue specialist, a man named Professor Alan Weir, whose name Ethan recognized from a paper on pressurization cycle fatigue he'd cited in his own published work 8 years ago, leaned forward. "Mr. Carter," Weir said, "the diagonal orientation you observed. Can you speak to why that specific angle suggested structural origin rather than surface damage?" "The angle was consistent with shear stress propagation in the frame section geometry," Ethan said. "A surface artifact, paint stress tooling, mark handling damage would present along a different axis relative to the load path. This was oriented at approximately 32 degrees off the frame center line, which is exactly where you'd expect to see a fatigue crack initiating at the stress concentration point of the frame-to-skin attachment." Gentleman Weir sat back. He looked at Dr. Marsh. Something passed between them. "That is consistent," Weir said quietly, "with the finite element analysis our team ran on the production frame geometry." He looked at Ethan. "You identified this visually, without computational support." "I've spent a long time looking at metal," Ethan said. Robert Kiley uncapped his pen. Dr. Marsh looked at him. "Mr. Kiley, Does your client wish to make a statement at this time? Kylie looked at his notepad. He looked at Ethan. He looked at the panel. And then he did something that Ethan suspected his legal team had spent considerable time debating. He made a choice. My client, Kylie said carefully, is prepared to cooperate fully with the panel's technical review and acknowledges the significance of the findings presented this morning. He paused. We would request the opportunity to present our own structural analysis data and to engage with Mr. Carter directly on the technical findings. Dr. Marsh looked at Ethan. That's fine with me, Ethan said. The room breathed. The morning session ran 3 hours. By the break, Robert Kiley had said more than his legal team had probably intended him to say, because Weir and Ethan together had made a technical case so precise and so grounded in physical reality that the alternative continued defense of a production design that the data was clearly contradicting would have required the kind of public dishonesty that even corporate legal teams have limits on sustaining. During the break, Hutchins found Ethan in the corridor. "You know what just happened in there," Hutchins said. "I have a sense," Ethan said. "They're going to issue the airworthiness directive," Hutchins said. "Probably before the end of the month. Mandatory inspection of every early production unit in that window. Potential design modification." He paused. 60 aircraft, Ethan. Maybe more when they expand the analysis. Every one of them is going to be inspected because you crouched down in a hangar in Texas at 2 in the morning and looked at the right piece of metal. Ethan leaned against the corridor wall. He was tired in the good way, the Racewell runway that Ben had identified weeks ago. He thought about a Tuesday night and a pot of ramen and a phone call from Gerald Marsh that had pulled him out of a quiet kitchen and dropped him into this particular chain of events. "Dale," he said, "how many of those 60 aircraft have been in regular service?" "Most of them." "Why?" "How many pressurization cycles average in the last 24 months?" Hutchins looked at him. He understood the question. "We don't have exact numbers yet, but for aircraft in regular corporate service..." He stopped. He did the math. His face did something careful. Several hundred, each. "So the cracks have been growing," Ethan said. "In all of them, at different rates depending on their service profile, but growing." "Yes," Hutchins said. "And none of them have failed," Ethan said. "Not yet." "No. How close is the closest one, do you think?" "Based on propagation modeling." Hutchins was quiet for a moment. "Our preliminary models suggest some of those units may be within 100 to 150 cycles of a critical threshold." He paused. "That's weeks, Ethan. For some of them, not months." The corridor was very still around them. Ethan looked at the floor. He thought about a specific Tuesday night. He thought about Ben texting, "Dad, you up yet?" at dawn. He thought about the particular shape of a 4-centimeter crack in a flashlight beam at 2:17 a.m. He thought about what it means when the thing you found is even bigger than you knew. "We need to push for an emergency directive," he said. "Not end of month. This week." Babada. Hutchins looked at him. "That's going to require the panel to move fast. Kylie's client is going to push back hard on the timeline." "Then we need to be more persuasive than they are," Ethan said. "Come back in with me." He walked back into the conference room before the break was over. Dr. Marsh looked up. "Mr. Carter, we still have 10 minutes. "I know. I need to present something." He was already at the whiteboard. "If the panel will allow me." She looked at him. She looked at Hutchins, who had followed him in. She nodded. Ethan picked up a marker. He drew the frame section. He drew the crack. He drew the propagation model, the cycle projections, the critical threshold. He did it in 4 minutes cleanly with the efficiency of a man who had been explaining complex structural concepts to people who needed to understand them for his entire professional life. When he set the marker down, the room was very quiet. "Some of these aircraft," he said, "are weeks away from a critical threshold, not months. I'm asking the panel to consider an emergency airworthiness directive. Ground inspection mandatory within 72 hours. He looked at Dr. Marsh. I know what that means logistically. I know what it costs. I'm telling you what the medal says. Robert Kiley opened his mouth. Professor Weir spoke first. Dr. Marsh, the propagation model Mr. Carter has presented is consistent with our preliminary analysis. If his service cycle assumptions are accurate. He looked at Ethan. What's your confidence level on those numbers? Conservative estimate, Ethan said. I used the low end of typical corporate service profiles. The real numbers are probably higher. Weir looked at Dr. Marsh. I support the request. Putoy. Kiley put his pen down. He looked at the whiteboard. He looked at the crack diagram. He looked at the numbers. And in his eyes, Ethan saw the specific moment when a man who has been defending a position calculates the cost of continuing to defend it against the cost of what happens if the position is wrong. Kiley looked at Dr. Marsh. My client, he said, would not oppose an emergency directive with a 72-hour compliance window. Dr. Marsh looked at Ethan for a long moment. Mr. Carter, she said. I've been on review panels for 19 years. She paused. This is the clearest presentation of field-to-model correlation I have seen in this room. She looked at the panel. We'll convene for deliberation in 10 minutes. I expect this to be brief. It was brief. 31 minutes after Ethan put the marker down, Dr. Marsh came back into the room and confirmed that the panel was recommending an emergency airworthiness directive for immediate processing. 72 hours, every early production unit in the window, mandatory ground inspection before next flight. Victoria, who had sat through the entire session in the chair against the wall and said nothing, because she understood that this was Ethan's room, his language, his domain, and that her job today was to be present and to witness, stood up when Dr. Marsh made the announcement. She didn't say anything, she just stood. Ethan looked at her. She was looking at him with the expression of someone who has watched something rare happen and is trying to hold all of it at once. He looked away first. He looked at his legal pad. He looked at the whiteboard with the crack diagram still on it. Somewhere in the country right now, 60 aircraft were on the ground or in the air, and within 72 hours, every one of them would be inspected by someone with the tools and the knowledge to look at the right place and find what was there. Then he thought about the people on those aircraft, names he would never know, routes he would never trace, lives that would continue because a Tuesday night phone call from Gerald Marsh had pulled him away from a pot of ramen and put him in front of a flashlight and a hairline crack that nobody else had thought to look for. He breathed. He picked up his legal pad. He capped his pen. He was ready to go home. Yes, sir. The flight back was at 6 p.m. They got to the airport with time enough to sit in a gate area with bad coffee and the particular exhaustion of a day that had carried significant weight. Victoria sat across from him. She looked like the day had taken something out of her and put something else in the way days sometimes do when they are the kind of days that actually matter. Can I ask you something personal? She said. You can ask, he said. When you left, 4 years ago, after Sarah, she paused. Did you know you were going to go back to work like this? He thought about it, really thought about it, not the polished answer, but the actual truth. No, he said. I thought I was done. Not in a dramatic way, I just thought the chapter was finished. That I was going to be Ben's dad and a maintenance tech, and that was going to be enough. He paused. And it was enough. That's the part people don't understand. I wasn't miserable. I wasn't waiting to be rescued. I was fine. But, she said, but there's a difference between fine and fully alive, he said. And I didn't know I'd stopped being fully alive until the night I found that crack, and I felt... He stopped. He looked for the right word. Certain, he said. I felt completely certain. In a way I hadn't felt about anything except Ben in 4 years. He looked at his coffee cup. That's not a small feeling. Victoria was quiet for a moment. I think I've spent most of my professional life trying to manufacture that feeling, she said. Certainty, control, the sense that I know what's going to happen because I planned it well enough. She paused. And then you walked into my hangar and you had it naturally. Without the plan, without the position, without any of the infrastructure I've built around myself to feel it. She looked at him. That's what I couldn't stop thinking about. The days after. It's not a talent, he said. It's just practice. Looking at things honestly until you stop being afraid of what you see. She looked at him for a long moment. How do you teach that? You can't really, he said. You can create conditions where people are more likely to develop it. You remove the incentives for dishonesty. You make it safe to say the true thing, even when it's inconvenient. You put people in rooms where the only currency that matters is accuracy. He paused. That's what the safety division is ultimately. It's a room where accuracy is the only currency. She nodded slowly. That's why you took it. That's exactly why I took it, he said. The boarding call came. They gathered their things. In the line moving toward the gate, Victoria's phone rang. She glanced at it, answered, listened for 10 seconds, said, "Forward it to legal," and hung up. Kylie's firm, she said. The manufacturer wants to schedule a direct conversation about the inspection protocol. Apparently, they want to discuss incorporating our NDT findings into their production quality process going forward. She looked at Ethan. They want to talk to you specifically. Ethan raised an eyebrow. The company that spent this morning defending the design wants to talk to the man who proved it was flawed. Apparently, Victoria said. Kylie told my counsel they were, quote, impressed by the field analysis. Ethan thought about this for a moment. When? They're suggesting next week. He stepped through the gate door. Tell them I'm available, but I want Hutchins in the room. Done, she said. And he could hear in her voice the quiet satisfaction of a woman who had spent 6 weeks watching a thing she built become better than it was, and who was beginning to understand that this was not a temporary condition. Ben was awake when Ethan got home. It was past 9, and he should have been asleep, but he was sitting on the couch in his pajamas with his homework done and his backpack packed for tomorrow, and the look on his face of a boy who had decided staying up was worth whatever consequence it carried. His Aunt Carol was in the kitchen doing dishes, and she raised her eyebrows at Ethan in the fond, exasperated way of someone who had tried and failed to enforce a bedtime. Hey, Ben said. Hey, Ethan said. He sat down next to him on the couch. He was still in his work clothes, still carrying his legal pad. He set it on the coffee table and leaned back, and Ben leaned against him the way he had since he was small, automatic, and complete. How'd it go? Ben said. Good, Ethan said. Really good, actually. Did they listen to you? Yeah, they listened. And Ben was quiet for a moment. Outside, a car went past. Carol finished the dishes and dried her hands and came to the doorway of the living room, looked at the two of them on the couch, and quietly decided to let them be. Dad, Ben said. How many people? Ethan looked at the ceiling. He thought about the propagation models, the cycle projections, the 60 aircraft, the weeks and not months. He thought about the emergency directive. 72 hours. A lot, Bud, he said. We don't know exactly, but a lot. Ben absorbed this. His head was still against Ethan's arm. His breathing was slow and steady. Mom would say something about that, Ben said. Yeah, what would she say? She'd say, he stopped. He thought about it with real care, the way he thought about things that mattered. She'd say that you were always going to do this, that you always knew how. You just needed the right crack to find. Ethan went completely still. The right crack to find. He sat with that for a long time. Long enough that Ben's breathing slowed further and his weight shifted, and Ethan realized the boy had fallen asleep against him right there on the couch in the specific boneless way of a child who had held himself awake through sheer determination and finally let go. He didn't move. He sat with his son's weight against him and the legal pad on the coffee table and the quiet of the house around them. And he thought about Sarah. He thought about her with the fullness that had become possible over the last few months. Not the grief-first way, not the way that starts with losing her and ends with what's left, but the whole way, the complete person. Her clarity, her honesty, her absolute refusal to look away from true things. He thought about a Tuesday night that had started with instant noodles and ended with everything changing. He thought about a crack in the metal that was never really just a crack in the metal. It was the moment that had been waiting for him. The specific intersection of who he was and what he'd chosen and what the world needed. And he had been standing in exactly the right place, looking in exactly the right direction. Because 4 years of choosing Ben over everything had made him into the kind of man who looked carefully at things, who didn't need applause to do the right thing, who couldn't be bought off the truth by any number that anyone put in front of him. Sarah had always said the work finds the person, not the other way around. He hadn't understood that fully until now. 3 months after the Washington panel, the FAA issued its formal airworthiness directive covering 63 aircraft. Every one of them was inspected. 7 were found to have cracks requiring immediate structural repair. 2 of those were assessed as having been within a very small number of pressurization cycles from potential critical failure. The report didn't name Ethan Carter. Federal safety documents don't work that way. But Dale Hutchins named him in a presentation to the Aviation Safety Institute in February as the field inspector whose initial identification had triggered the entire chain of events. The room was full of engineers and safety professionals and FAA representatives and pilots. And when Hutchins said the name, there was a moment of quiet, and then something that grew into sustained, genuine applause. Bow. Ethan wasn't there. He was in Texas. He was in a middle school gymnasium watching Ben play in a basketball tournament, sitting in the bleachers in his worn jacket with a cup of terrible concession stand coffee, cheering too loudly when Ben made a shot, and not minding at all that the parents around him were looking. His phone buzzed in his pocket. Victoria. He looked at it between plays. Hutchins just mentioned you at the ASI conference. Standing ovation. Thought you should know. He looked at the court. Ben was running back on defense, his face focused and alive, those same eyebrows. He typed back, Ben just scored. Good day all around. Her reply came in seconds. Tell him his dad is kind of a big deal. He smiled. He put his phone in his pocket. On the court. Ben stole the ball. He drove the lane with the fearless, unself-conscious commitment of a 10-year-old who had not yet learned to be afraid of the things he was capable of. He went up. He laid it in. The gymnasium erupted. Ben landed, looked up at the bleachers. Found his father's face with the precision of a child who always knew where his parent was in a room, and he grinned. The full gap-toothed grin. His mother's grin. Ethan stood up. He clapped. He was one of those parents. He had decided he was fine with that. Later after the game, walking to the truck in the cold parking lot, Ben's gym bag over his shoulder, and his son walking next to him with the loose-limbed satisfaction of an athlete after a good performance, Ben said, Dad, that lady texted you during the game. Victoria, yeah. What did she say? Ethan unlocked the truck. He thought about Washington and the whiteboard and a crack diagram that had become an emergency directive, that had become 7 aircraft grounded and repaired and cleared, and a number of people alive who didn't know they were alive because of one Tuesday night. He thought about Sarah. He thought about the right crack to find. She said, good work, he said. Ben climbed in and buckled his seatbelt and thought about this for a moment. You did do good work, he said. You do good work all the time. Ethan started the engine. It turned over on the second try the way it always did. So do you, bud, he said. He pulled out of the parking lot and onto the road, and the Texas cold came in at the edges of the windows, and the truck moved through it steadily, reliably, without drama the way it always did. Varsh. And Ethan Carter drove his son home through the winter dark, a man who had chosen fatherhood over ambition, and then discovered in the best way possible that the choice had made him ready for everything that came after. Some men spend their lives chasing the moment when the world finally sees what they are worth. Ethan Carter had spent 4 years becoming someone worth seeing, and when the moment came at 2:17 in the morning with a flashlight and a 4-centimeter crack, and a room full of people who had already decided he didn't matter, he had been completely quietly, unshakably ready. That is not luck. That is what integrity looks like when it has been lived in the dark long enough to become bone.